Alright, it's been a while since we've done a video, but this one is going to be on basically the first part of what we think of as the civil rights movement. I'm going to go through some background to kind of refresh your memory where we've come this semester, and then go through up until about 1960 with the civil rights movement, so you get an idea of what was going on in that 1950s period when what we've done so far, 50s society said everything was nice and wonderful, and the truth for a lot of people is it wasn't. And so we'll be looking specifically at African Americans in this video. Alright, so some of the background to what was going on. If you remember back to the Gilded Age and the post-Reconstruction era in the South enacted what we came to call the Jim Crow laws. Those were the laws that instituted what's called de jure segregation. De jure is a Latin term, and what it means is it means by law. So this is segregation by law. And so it was legal. Building codes mandated that you had to have separate bathrooms, separate water fountains. Eventually, the city codes are going to require separate seating on buses. And this is all found to be constitutional in 1895 in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which we've gone over. Just to refresh your memory, this is the one that legalized that Jim Crow system and started the idea of separate but equal. The facilities could be separate as long as they were quote-unquote equal, which the South then is going to take to mean, well, you have the facilities. Doesn't necessarily mean they are equal in quality. And in the early 1900s, we've talked about the formation of the NAACP, which was this organization that fights to end segregation and discrimination. And in the early 1900s, they were fighting specifically for integration of the races, and they did this in a couple different ways. One of the ways they did that was through using the court system, filing lawsuits against businesses and government entities that practiced segregation and discrimination. They also lobbied Congress and state governments to enact laws that would be beneficial to African Americans and that would bring about integration. And so through the early 1900s, they were building up small victories in small court cases. Now, they also went through and they investigated and publicized the results of their investigations in racist incidents around the country. In 1919, 1920, 1921, the race riots right after World War I, they investigated a number of those and publicized, what is it that was said to have caused it, what is it that was actually caused it. That way, people knew what was going on. Now, even though the NAACP is a great organization that fought for an end to segregation, there were people who were opposed to them, and I'm not talking about I'm not talking about white people. I'm talking about African Americans. Okay? The UNIA movement, which we went through in the Harlem Renaissance, they were formed in opposition to the NAACP. There were large numbers of African Americans who didn't feel that the NAACP fought for them. Okay? If you want to think of it this way, the NAACP was for the more upper class, more well-to-do African Americans. UNIA billed itself as an organization for the common, ordinary African Americans. Okay? During their period of coexistence, the NAACP had 500,000 members. UNIA had 3 million. And, of course, they weren't interested in integration. They were interested in promoting black nationalism, pride of the African American community, and working together to build up that community, but also separatism. Okay? They didn't see any value in integration in many cases, and so they sought separatism. Now, there's also controversy, and this is why some people did not like the NAACP, because the NAACP picked and chose its battles. One of the controversies that happens in the 30s. There's these young men. They're called the Scottsboro Boys. They were arrested. They were riding a train through the South, and they were arrested in a rail car along with 2 white women. And despite lack of evidence, the police accused them of kidnapping and rape. And they got the two women to go along with it, probably on the idea of, they wouldn't be charged and they'd be released. And these guys were facing, lengthy jail sentences. And all the evidence was, there was no evidence. But the NAACP chose originally not to represent them because the NAACP said, look, these guys have a record. We're not going to fight a losing case. They were willing to let these guys go to prison for the rest of their lives. Now, we've also talked about stuff in the 40s. We've talked about World War II. During World War II, when the African-American community debated should they or should they not support the war effort, they ultimately said, well, let's support the war effort and let's come up with a double V campaign. Victory at home. Victory abroad. Victory over Hitler and his evil and racism. Victory over discrimination and segregation here at home. Hoping that at the end of World War II, the United States would change and would start to grant African Americans their rights. Right? And I would have told you that it's my opinion that when that didn't happen, that helped start the modern civil rights movement. In 1942, there's another organization that forms. They're called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. Okay? So you have to understand, there's more than just the NAACP out there fighting for an end to segregation. CORE is going to engage in more active protest. While the NAACP is kind of working behind the scenes, organizing lawsuits and lobbying efforts, CORE is actually going to go out there and they're going to organize strikes and organize pickets. They're going to organize some of the first sit-ins that were directed against businesses, not the restaurants that we think of from the 60s, which we'll mention briefly at the end of this video. But they started actively protesting for their rights. In 1948, we've also talked about Truman and how Truman integrated the military, and that's a huge step in the civil rights movement, bringing the military to where it was fully integrated. All right, here's where we pick up with some new stuff. And right here we're looking at the NAACP and how they started fighting for an end to segregation in society. The first place they're going to attack is education. Okay? The idea of segregated education is just absolutely wrong. The idea of separate but equal in education just does not work. And the NAACP set out to prove that. And so the NAACP came up with what they called the three-prong strategy. 3 ways to attack segregation in public schools. The first one was in addressing transportation issues. In some places in the South, you had the county school district. Okay? In Texas, it's hard for us to understand. We have our local school districts. But imagine the entire county is one school district. And you might have a couple different high schools spread throughout the county. Well, under segregation, one of those high schools was the black high school. So what if they put it in the extreme southwest corner? Your kids up in the northeast corner of the county, it's too far for them to get to school. Their parents may not be able to take them all the way across the county and then go back to work. And so those kids couldn't get to school because the counties didn't provide transportation. And so the NAACP started suing school districts, saying if you're going to create a school and you're going to put it in an uncomfortable distance away, you need to also provide transportation. Secondly, they attacked teacher pay. Okay? Who do you think would earn more? The teachers at the white schools or the teachers at the black schools? If you said the teachers at the white schools, you're right. And so if you were a good teacher and you went to teach at the black school, financially you could not remain there, even if you were a good teacher, even if you had a heart for those kids. If you're going to have a family and you're going to afford to take care of them, you're either going to have to quit education or move over to the white school where you can make a living. And so the NAACP started suing on behalf of teachers, saying if you're going to hire them to teach kids, you need to pay them the same throughout the entire school district. Finally, they also started to attack higher education. Segregation in colleges and universities. They're not going to focus on elementary school yet. They're going to focus on colleges and universities because they felt this is where they could get the most bang for their buck, to borrow a phrase from Eisenhower. Okay. In the South, the southern states had a rule. If you could get a bachelor's degree, and you then wanted to pursue a master's degree, and there was no black college in the state for you to do that, they would pay for you to go anywhere outside of the South to get your master's degree or your doctorate. Now, in 1950, there's going to be two court cases. We're going to start with McLaren versus Oklahoma. McLaren versus Oklahoma. Mr. McLaren wants to go to OU, wants to pursue further education there in OU. And the state of Oklahoma told him no originally. Well, after he sued in state court, they ruled that, well, since there was not a program for him in the segregated colleges, they had to let him go to OU. So the state agreed to let him go to OU and provided him with his own separate places to study in the library, his own separate table to eat at cafeterias. They even provided him a special desk for the classrooms outside the door, outside the classroom. So he sued, and it got before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said this denied him equal protection. That he did not have access to an equal education because he wasn't even in the same room. And so this forces the integration of OU. And there's another court case in the same year, Sweat versus Painter. This one comes out of Texas. It involved law school. Mr. Sweat wanted to be a lawyer and did not want to leave the state in order to do that. So the state of Texas originally said, well, they would create a law school at one of the African-American colleges, Texas Southern. But when they created it, the legislature had already gone out of session, and in Texas, the legislature only meets every 2 years. And so the decision was he would have access to the law school, but it wouldn't be funded for 2 years, so he wouldn't have professors, he wouldn't have a law library. And he successfully argued that that put him at a disadvantage later on in the job market, because it created a situation where there was unequal education. He was going to put on his resume that, well, I attended law school for 2 years, and it was basically independent study. And not having access to that was then going to deny him the ability to get jobs. And so the Supreme Court ruled also in 1950 that UT Law School had to admit African Americans because there was no equal law school for them in the state. Now, the reason those two cases are important, I mean, they're important because they integrate higher education, but they're also important because they set the stage for Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court case in 1954 that ended segregation in public schools. Okay. The lawyer for the NAACP and the lawyer for the Browns is a guy named Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall went before the Supreme Court and argued that Topeka, Kansas, that's where this case comes from, their segregation of public schools violated the Constitution. Linda Brown lived down the street from a white school, but because she was black, she had to go 6 miles away from her house. If she was going to walk to school, she had to walk across a busy street. She had to walk through a rail yard in order to get to school. Thurgood Marshall brought in some experiments that were done by two psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark. You can Google the Clark experiments. You can also Google the Dahl experiments. And what they found is that if you look at this picture here, they took kids and they put them in a room and they presented them with a white doll or a black doll and basically said, which one of these do you want to play with? And the black kids would pick the white dolls. Now the white kids would also pick the white dolls. And they would give standard, 4-year-old, 5-year-old answers. Why did you pick this? Oh, because it's a baby. Because it's going to be my baby, whatever. The black kids, when they picked up the white doll, it was kind of weird because, wait a minute, here's a black doll. Why aren't you picking that one up? And the black kids all responded, well, because white is better than black. And the findings of the study was, what was happening in society with segregation of schools, segregation of everything, was teaching blacks that they were second-class citizens, and therefore they weren't as good. The Supreme Court used that of Thurgood Marshall's arguments in striking down the idea of segregation in public schools. In their decision, which was 9-0, it was a unanimous decision, they wrote that separate is inherently unequal. This is obviously one of the most important Supreme Court cases in U.S. history. Now, it wasn't without its critics. Okay? In 1955, Southerners, politicians got together, and they wrote this thing that's been described as the Southern Manifesto, where they complained about the Supreme Court. They complained about what people might say nowadays, activist judges telling them what to do, not following the Constitution and allowing states' rights. And they said that they would fight the Brown versus Board of Education tooth and nail as much as they could. Well, 2 years later, in 1956, schools weren't desegregating. The Brown decision said they had to, and so another lawsuit was launched, and sometimes it's called Brown versus Board of Education Part 2. I've just labeled it Brown 2 here, where they went to the Supreme Court and they said, okay, you've told the schools to desegregate. How long do they have? And unfortunately, in this case, the Supreme Court kind of weaseled their way out of it, and they said, well, desegregation had to proceed with, quote, all deliberate speed. They have to desegregate as soon as it's possible for them to do that. Consequently, by 1964, 10 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, 2% of all Southern schools were desegregated. They'd had 10 years and only 2% of the schools. In most cases throughout the South, it's going to take a lawsuit. It's going to take fighting. In many cases, when schools finally did quote-unquote desegregate, someone would sue over it saying, this really isn't desegregation, and a judge would rule, yeah, it's not. Dallas ISD, Dallas Independent School District, just got out from under desegregation orders in, I want to say it was 2001. To be fair, starting around 1980, they were really trying. They were really trying to desegregate and thought they had a plan every single year, but it turned out it wasn't good enough. Now, Brown versus Board of Education is important. Another important instance in the early civil rights movement is the Montgomery bus boycott. It took place in Montgomery, Alabama, and you probably know the story of Rosa Parks being arrested. Okay. Rosa Parks had a full-time job. She was a laundress. She worked in a laundry, but she was also a secretary for the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP. And she was not the first African-American to sit on the bus in protest of segregation. But again, the NAACP, they pick and choose their battles, and so when the person that does it 6 months before Rosa Parks has a record and is also arrested for assaulting a police officer at the same time, you don't use her as your focal point. Rosa Parks is a nice, wonderful, sweet old grandma. In fact, when she got on the bus, she sat in the right section. She sat in the back. These buses, they had signs, basically. All right, if you're black, you have to sit behind this sign. And as more white riders would get on, they would actually pick the sign up and move it back. And if they moved it behind your seat, you had to get up. And that's where she was. And when they moved the sign, she refused to give up her seat. And not having any kind of police record, she was the focal point of the Montgomery bus boycott as they protested her arrest and the segregation of the city buses. Martin Luther King Jr. was pastor already there in Montgomery, and he was an outspoken critic of segregation. He was chosen to lead the boycott. And he worked every day to make sure that that boycott was going. I apologize for the picture being in the way. But this thing, because he was the leader of the boycott, because he was the spokesperson for the boycott, that put him in the national spotlight. This is what made him a nationally known figure and what made everybody in the United States know who he was. Again, I apologize for the picture. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted from December of 55 to, that is, December of 1956. It actually lasted just under a year. And partly due to lost revenue, ultimately the city of Montgomery desegregated their buses. Now again, this is not without consequence. Okay? Many people who chose to follow the boycott. The African American community paid a price for this. People lost their jobs because they didn't show up to work on time, because their bosses knew they weren't riding the bus, and so they found reasons to fire them. The good news is there were also white people in Montgomery who found African Americans that either worked with them or worked for them, and some of these white people actually volunteered themselves to their friends and said, look, we will drive into your neighborhood to pick you up and bring you to work because we know you want to support the boycott and you don't have any other way to get to work. So there is good even with the bad, and ultimately they did desegregate the buses. Now Martin Luther King, his strategy, of course, you should already know this. He believed in non-violent protest. He would refuse to lead marches that turned violent. He drew his inspiration from something that was going on in the 40s. Okay? On the other side of the world, in India, Mahatma Gandhi led nonviolent protest against British occupation of India, and helped drive the British out of India and get India its independence. He also, if you remember back to the first semester, he took inspiration from this man named Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau had written a book, and we talk about this strategy called civil disobedience. And that's also part of Martin Luther King's strategy. It's not just nonviolent protest, it's also civil disobedience, where you deliberately disobey an unjust law. Martin Luther King would march. He would march in protest of segregation laws. He would be arrested. And we don't necessarily think of our pastors being arrested. Oh, look, the religious leader is being arrested. Well, we don't usually think of that as a good thing. But if you're practicing civil disobedience, you're saying, this law is wrong, and I'm going to deliberately disobey it, and I'm willing to go to jail and pay the price because this law is wrong. Now, in 1957, partly because of his leadership of the boycott, in 1957, Martin Luther King was elected president of the newly formed Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. So here comes another civil rights organization that also still exists. Now, also in 1957, we'll go to Little Rock, Arkansas, another event in this early civil rights movement. The Little Rock Nine. These 9 African-American kids who, after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, decided that they wanted to go to Central High School in Little Rock. Okay? And when they went to the school and said, we want to go to school here, of course the school denied them. They got their lawyers. Their lawyers threatened to sue the school district. And the school district was going to be forced to let them in. The governor of Arkansas, a man named Orville Faubus, called out the Arkansas National Guard. And the next day when these students showed up to school, the Arkansas National Guard was used to block their entry to the high school. They were refused entry by the National Guard, guys with guns. Now, to this point, President Eisenhower takes a lot of criticism for his approach, or lack thereof, to civil rights issues. And this cartoon over here, Eisenhower, the fire chief, looking out the window at the problems with civil rights and saying, oh, someone should do something about that. And he takes a lot of criticism for that, and probably rightly so. Supposedly, he was worried about creating a second civil war. That's how bad the crisis was. The incident in Little Rock makes him do something. He's going to federalize the National Guard. What that means is the National Guard, if you're in the state, you're under the orders of your governor, but you can also be under the orders of the president. And the president's orders supersede the governor's. So President Eisenhower federalized the National Guard. He took over and ordered them out. You must leave. He then ordered the 101st Airborne in to protect the students that were going to school. And so when the 101st came in, then the Little Rock 9 got to go to school. 101st Airborne would remain in Central High School for the remainder of the year, protecting these students who were going to school. What you don't see in this picture, you see the kids being escorted into the building, and you can see these soldiers here on the ends of their rifles. They have fixed bayonets. This is a show of force. Because what you don't see is from out here where the camera is, you don't see the angry mob and the angry crowd that is threatening to kill these teenagers simply because they want to go to school. Governor Falbus would respond the next year by closing all Little Rock public schools. This is something called the Lost Year. That was decided that would be the way to prevent integration from happening in the schools. Of course, a year later they would reopen, but still, that's probably not the best strategy for trying to fight against something, closing all your public schools. We'll end in 1960 with a couple things that happen. The first one happens in Greensboro, North Carolina. The first student sit-in at a lunch counter. A lunch counter was, maybe we all know kind of what a Waffle House is. If you can imagine taking a Waffle House and putting it inside a department store. That would be a lunch counter. You could go, you could do your shopping in the department store in Dillard's or Macy's or wherever, and then you could go over to the lunch counter and get something to eat. This one took place in Woolworth's department store. These four young men were students at the university there in Greensboro, and they decided that they would go to the lunch counter, and they would sit at the lunch counter, and they would sit there until they were served. And that's the thing with the sit-in. You go and you sit where you're not supposed to until you are served. And if you look over in this picture, just one thing to point out, who the server is. For a lot of the people that worked on the lunch counters, they were African Americans, and they could not serve their own kind. Not because they didn't want to, but because if they did, they were going to get fired. And so imagine the position that some of those people were in. I see what you're doing, and I'm really glad you're doing it, but I can't serve you. It's a terrible position to be put in. And we'll talk more about some of the positions that they were put in, and how some of those people actually didn't like the sit-ins because of what was going to happen. We'll talk about that later. In 1960, there's also yet another group that forms called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee came out of CORE. There was a meeting of the Congress of Racial Equality, and these students, these 18, 19, 20-year-old students showed up and said, well, we have some ideas, and the leadership of CORE said, no, you just do what we tell you. We've already chosen the path. Well, some of the leaders of CORE then went to him and basically said, look, here's the deal. We're old. We're kind of set in our ways. We have our plan. You guys need to form your own group. That way you can be active on your college campuses, and you can engage in your own protests. And number one, it's another path for us to fight for civil rights. Number two, we can come along beside you, and we can support you with what you need while you do your thing and we do our thing. And we both fight to achieve the same goal. We're going to end there today. We will talk more about civil rights. We'll look at what happens in the 60s, and we'll look at the violence and everything that goes along with that later.